In 1796, if you were looking for the decisive front of the French Revolutionary Wars, you would not have started in northern Italy. Paris was watching the Rhine. The Directory's larger hopes were tied to the armies moving toward Germany, where a victory might force Austria to negotiate. The Low Countries and the German frontier had carried the weight of the war for years. Italy, by comparison, looked like a secondary theatre. Difficult mountains, poor roads, thin supplies, and a campaign that seemed useful but not central. That is why Napoleon Bonaparte's new command was not, at first, a perfect stage prepared for a rising star. It was closer to a neglected assignment. The Army of Italy was expected to pressure Austria's southern flank, distract enemy forces, and perhaps win something useful if the main offensive elsewhere succeeded. But this was exactly what made the campaign important. Napoleon did not begin with the strongest French army. He began with a front that Paris had underestimated, against enemies who appeared dangerous only when seen as one solid mass. His first achievement was not simply winning battles. It was seeing that this forgotten theatre could be turned into the place where the war's rhythm changed. Before he could do that, however, he had to face the army he had inherited. The army he inherited did not look like an army ready to change Europe. The army of Italy was hungry, underpaid, and badly supplied. Some soldiers lacked decent shoes. Some units were short of muskets. Horses, wagons, and food were never enough. Men who had marched for the Republic were now asked to fight in mountains while wondering whether they would eat, whether their pay would arrive, and whether Paris remembered them at all. This matters because Napoleon's first Italian campaign is often remembered backwards. We know what came later, so it is easy to imagine him arriving with a machine already built for victory. He did not. He inherited a force neglected precisely because France's main hopes lay elsewhere. But the army of Italy was not useless. It was a damaged instrument, not an empty one. Inside this hungry army were hard veterans, aggressive officers, and divisional commanders with real ability. Massena had risen from the ranks and had already proved his energy in the mountains. Augereau was bold, rough, and dangerous in attack. Serrurier brought older professional experience and steadiness. Berthier, as chief of staff, gave the army something Napoleon badly needed: order, coordination, and a way to turn scattered reports into usable commands. So the problem before Napoleon was double. He had to discipline and feed an army close to exhaustion. Then he had to convince that same army that victory was still possible. Only after that could he look outward, toward the enemy line. When Napoleon looked outward from his own exhausted army, the enemy seemed stronger than France's position should allow. On paper, the danger was simple: an Austrian army under Beaulieu and a Piedmont-Sardinian army under Colli stood across northern Italy. If those forces acted together, Napoleon would be outnumbered, blocked in the mountains, and forced to fight on terms chosen by his enemies. But the coalition was not a wall. It was a chain, and several links were already weak. Beaulieu and Colli were allies, but not one army. Their troops were spread across mountain roads, passes, valleys, and defensive positions that were difficult to support quickly. Their political needs were also different. Austria was guarding its imperial position in northern Italy and the road toward Milan. Piedmont-Sardinia was thinking about its own territory, its capital at Turin, and the survival of the kingdom. Cooperation existed, but trust was thin, and timing was fragile. This was the opening Napoleon noticed. If he attacked the whole coalition as one solid mass, his poor army might break first. But if he struck the space between them, if he moved faster than they could coordinate, the two allied armies could be pulled apart. That was the real logic of the campaign. Napoleon did not need to smash a wall. He needed to tear a chain at its weakest link. The first blow would fall at Montenotte. Montenotte was not important, because it was the largest battle of the campaign. It was important because it showed how Napoleon intended to fight. Beaulieu had expected the French to threaten Genoa. That expectation pulled Austrian attention toward the coast and left Argento's corps exposed near the center of the Allied line. The position mattered because it sat close to the space between the Austrian army and the Piedmont-Sardinian forces. If that space broke open, the coalition would no longer be able to behave like one army. Napoleon moved quickly. He reinforced the threatened French troops with La Harpe, pushed Masséna through difficult ground toward the Austrian flank, and kept Augereau ready to press toward the Piedmontese side. The point was not simply to defeat the Austrians in front of him. The point was to strike the joint that connected one enemy to the other. On April 20th, 1796, that joint began to give way. Argento's troops were hit before Beaulieu could properly support them. The Austrians were pushed back, and the gap between the two Allied forces widened. This was the first clear display of the method: speed, concentration, and pressure on the connection point. Montenotte did not end the campaign. It made the next move possible. The chain had not broken yet, but it had begun to stretch. After Montenotte, Napoleon did not pause to celebrate a neat battlefield victory. He used the opening before the coalition could close it. The next days were not 4 separate episodes. They were one continuous tearing motion. At Millesimo, on April 13th, Augereau pressed the Piedmont-Sardinian side of the line. The pressure was costly and difficult, but it forced Colley's army to keep falling back instead of restoring contact with the Austrians. At Dego, on April 14th and 15th, Masséna and La Harpe drove against the Austrian side. The fighting there was messy, and the French themselves were not always disciplined. Dego was even briefly retaken by Austrian reinforcements before the French recovered it. But the larger direction of the campaign did not change. Beaulieu's army was being pushed one way, Colley's another. This is why the sequence matters. Napoleon was not simply adding victories to a list. He was preventing 2 Allied armies from becoming one operational problem. Every march, every attack, and every forced withdrawal widened the distance between them. By the time the Piedmontese withdrew toward Mondovì, Colley was running out of space and options. On April 21st, the French pursuit caught his army before it could settle into a new defensive position. The retreat turned into collapse. A week later, on April 28th, the Armistice of Cherasco removed Piedmont-Sardinia from the war. In less than 3 weeks, the first link of the coalition had been pulled loose. The Austrian army was still in the field. The campaign was far from over. But Napoleon had proved the central idea of his method: defeat the enemy's unity before trying to defeat all of its soldiers. After Cherasco, Napoleon had done what Paris had not expected from the Italian front. He had knocked Piedmont-Sardinia out of the war and turned fully against Austria. But the campaign still needed a road into Lombardy, and that road led toward the Adda River. On May 10, 1796, the French caught the Austrian rearguard near Lodi. The scene would later become one of the famous images of Napoleon's early career. French infantry attacking across a narrow bridge under artillery and musket fire. Officers urging men forward, the enemy finally giving way on the far bank. It was a hard and dramatic fight, but it should not be mistaken for the destruction of Beaulieu's main army. The Austrians at Lodi were mainly buying time for a wider retreat. Their task was to delay the French, not to decide the fate of northern Italy in one afternoon. That distinction matters. Lodi opened the way toward Milan and Lombardy, but its deeper effect was psychological. French soldiers saw their young commander close to the danger, sharing the pressure of the fight rather than directing it from a distant table. Around this moment, the bond between Napoleon and the army of Italy began to change. The bridge did not make him master of Italy. It helped make him memorable to his own men. Montenotte had shown the method. Lodi began to build the myth. But myths do not hold fortresses. Ahead of him stood Mantua. Lodi changed how the army of Italy spoke about Napoleon. It did not remove Austria from northern Italy. That difference is the key to the next stage. A tactical victory could open a road. A series of victories could give the French the initiative. But strategic control required something harder, the removal of Austria's main anchor in the region. That anchor was Mantua. Mantua was not just another city on the map. It was a fortress, a base, and a reason for Austrian armies to keep returning. As long as it held out, Austria still had a point of resistance inside the French position. Napoleon could enter Milan and push across Lombardy, but he could not simply declare the campaign finished while Mantua remained in enemy hands. So the war began to orbit around the fortress. The French had to blockade it, feed their own army, hold the surrounding roads, and still remain ready to fight Austrian relief forces in the field. Wurmser's later offensive showed how serious this problem was. Even after earlier defeats, Austria could still send another army, force Napoleon to react, and delay the fall of the fortress. This is why the Italian campaign cannot be reduced to one bridge, one charge, or 1 month of victories. Lodi gave Napoleon fame. Mantua tested whether that fame could survive a longer struggle. The answer would come only when Austria made one more major attempt to break through at Rivoli. At Rivoli, the final proof was not that Napoleon could make men charge. He had already shown that. The proof was that he could read a confused battlefield faster than his enemy could turn a plan into action. By January 1797, Alvinci was making another attempt to save Mantua. His force moved in several columns, aiming to envelop Joubert's division at Rivoli and open the road to the fortress. On paper, the design looked dangerous. In practice, it depended on timing, mountain roads, and separate columns arriving together under pressure. That was a difficult thing to make work. At first, the reports were scattered. Austrian movements appeared in more than one direction. But Joubert's messages revealed the main danger. A serious attack was forming around Rivoli. Napoleon responded by shifting the weight of the army toward that point. Masséna was ordered to march to Joubert's support. Guns, cavalry and reserves were redirected, while other forces watched the Adige and the approaches to Mantua. When Napoleon reached Rivoli, he did not command a comfortable superiority. He had a defensive position, a tired army, and an enemy trying to close around him. The French line bent under pressure, but the Austrian columns were also becoming separated, delayed, and crowded into difficult ground. Some had little cavalry or artillery support when they needed it most. Napoleon's answer was not a single heroic gesture. It was a sequence of decisions. Hold the battle, identify the most dangerous column, concentrate fire and counterattack before the Austrian pieces could lock together. Rivoli completed the lesson of the campaign. Napoleon could attack quickly when the enemy was divided. He could also rebuild a battle in crisis and make the enemy's own complexity collapse against him. After Rivoli, Mantua's fate was sealed. The Italian campaign had moved beyond a series of battlefield successes. It had produced something more durable, political weight. In Paris, Napoleon could no longer be treated as a fortunate young general commanding a secondary front. He had taken a neglected army, broken Piedmont-Sardinia out of the coalition, pushed Austria back in northern Italy, and forced Europe's rulers to pay attention to his name. The later negotiations that led to Campo Formio only strengthened that image. But this did not place him at the top of France. Not yet. What Italy gave him was capital, the loyalty of an army, the attention of Paris, and the reputation of a commander who could turn limited means into strategic results. The First Italian campaign did not make Napoleon ruler of France. It did not even give him power in Paris. But it changed what was possible. Montenotte proved speed. A neglected army could tear open an enemy coalition before it coordinated. Lodi created memory. Soldiers began to see their commander as more than a distant general. Rivoli completed the proof. He could also hold a crisis together when Austria tried to break through. After Mantua fell and Austria moved toward negotiation, the Italian front was no longer secondary. It had become the stage where Napoleon gained an army's loyalty, Paris's attention, and the reputation that the road to Brumaire would later require.